welcome to this Illusion HorrorCon panel about horror
Recording
inspiration,
in progress.
how to incorporate ideas from film and media into your scenarios. My name's Scott Dorwood, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this fantastic panel of guests. Let's go around and introduce ourselves. Pavel, can you start us off, please?
Sure, thanks. My name is Paweł Kicman. I'm a tabletop RPG designer from Poland, creator behind titles like Korpborg, which is corporate horror, Whispers of the Woods, which kind of integrates a lot from folk horror, but also multiple supplements to Morgborg and Cyborg, alongside some other titles. So yeah, glad to be here. Hello.
Fantastic. And Steve?
Hi, I'm Stephen Kuntz. People mostly know me as the author of the Fifth Conspiracy TTRPG, and from my time as the lead developer for the Roll20 Virtual Tabletop. You can find me at aedpublishing.com and at AED Publishing for all the socials.
Oh, thank you. And Vincent?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Vince. I am from Switzerland, and I am running a YouTube channel called Lorefall, where we cover all kind of things horror TTRPG, from lore to how to play to Let's Plays coming up pretty soon.
Wonderful. Topher?
Good morning. I'm Topher Burke. I'm a professional dungeon master and author. I wrote the Desert Whispers scenario for the Screams and Whispers sourcebook from Cult Divinity Lost. I've got some side publications of my own out on DM's Guild, taking movie plots and turning them into adventures. So I hope to have a lively panel discussion on this.
Oh, fantastic. And finally, Jacqueline.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Brick. You may also know me as Jax Romana. I am on the internet most places as Rufflejax. That's Rufflejax. I am the English language editor on Cult Divinity Lost. I also wrote the scenarios Lucena and the Rocket's Red Glare for Cult Divinity Lost, as well as the trauma horror section for Beyond Darkness and Madness. I've also worked on games like Changing the Lost 2nd Edition, Vampire the Requiem 2nd Edition, Deviant the Renegades, Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition, Mage 20th Edition, 20th Anniversary Edition, Exalted 3rd Edition, etc. And I am releasing a game in February called Bear Witness, which is based on the 2008 movie Martyrs.
Oh, 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 I can't wait to see that. Well, brilliant. Thank you. And also, just to remind anyone watching live that we encourage and welcome questions from the audience. So please do chip in if you have anything you'd like us to expand on, or any new directions you'd like to take us in. Well, let's start off then by just thinking about or discussing what kinds of media inspire us, and how we find different mediums inspiring. I think there's the assumption when we talk about taking inspiration from media that we're talking, primarily about lifting sections or ideas from films and books, but inspiration can come from all over the place: visual art, photography, music. What kinds of media inspire you, and how? Does anyone want to kick us off?
Sure, I can.
Go.
Oh, sorry. No,
Pavel,
go
go
on,
ahead.
Jacqueline.
All right. I really look for inspiration wherever it hits. I've been inspired by my own crash outs as much as I've been inspired by playlists I've made on Spotify. Inspiration is such a nebulous thing because we think of it as something that hits us when we're least expecting it, but you can also go and actively seek it out. And the fact that we're doing this panel, I think, is extremely helpful, because a lot of people sort of view inspiration as this nebulous goddess that kisses you on the forehead, and suddenly you can write 10,000 words. And because we're all in an industry that does operate on deadlines and practice and making sure that you can turn in something at the correct time so that it can go out to people. Being able to seek out inspiration in places where you know you'll find it, or where even where you have a pretty good idea you'll find it, I think is a good practice to be involved in.
Mhm. But Pavel, sorry, you were saying something as well.
Oh yeah, sorry, no. So yeah, I just wanted to say this is something that it's probably not shouldn't be part of this panel in particular, but there's a lot of inspiration, I think, from real world that comes to mind. But again, I think what kind of gives us, at least me, gives me kind of food for thought to actually process this is fiction. Because when I'm talking about like, real life stuff, I could go on and on about 7 years of corporate work that was based for all the horrors in corporate work. But also I've been reading, I've actually written a scenario for Hellboy recently that was inspired by real events of Second World War and a little bit of kind of history from my region. But it's all kind of, it's one thing, but the other thing is all those tropes from media that kind of helps to actually build a narrative around it. And you've mentioned, we probably most looking for kind of literature, film, but me myself, I kind of come from comic book background, so I tend to even unconsciously, like it's not always something that I think of, but there's definitely a lot of tropes that I took from comic books. And obviously, like writing Hellboy, I would go back to Hellboy comic books for that inspiration. But there's also, television, video games, other tabletop games, and I think especially other tabletop RPGs as well, because we don't only create narratives, we create mechanics, we create things to play. So naturally, the inspirations wouldn't be only kind of to tell the story, but also to present it mechanically. So looking at other people's games would be a good way to actually look for that kind of inspiration for that.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about taking inspiration from the real world and from history and so on, because I find the biggest problem with that in horror is sometimes the real world, and particularly history, is so much darker than anything that we can make up. You tend to add the supernatural horrors in there just to lighten things.
I know. Speaking of real world horrors, I know this is you guys were talking about it, and it just keeps springing up into my memory. The gallery of art that was painted by artists after World War One to depict the horrors of World War One is a huge source of inspiration for any kind of dark anything like that, because these images that these artists created are just so stark and striking.
Yeah, yeah. um, who wants to go next? Steve?
I'll share my experience with being inspired by fiction rather than the real world. And it's something that's impacted me pretty significantly. And I kind of go through like the phases of grief, but it's like the phases of inspiration where I start off gushing. I had this amazing experience. I read this novel. I watched this movie. And then that immediately gets followed by this plateau of grief that I might not ever write something as good as this thing that just inspired me, right? And then finally I start to decompose. What was it about the experience that impacted me so strongly? What is it that I got out of it? And then I try and figure out, well, that experience, how do I replicate that in a collaborative story setting, right? How would that translate from the medium that I just experienced it in? How could I replicate that for a group of people, get their buy-in for that experience and share it with them?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that experience of watching a film or reading a book that is related to what you're working on and realizing that it's so much better than anything you could do yourself is, yeah, I guess some people might see it as a challenge, but it can be soul destroying. Uh,
Yeah, for me, so personally, I work my day job as a film composer. So
oh, right.
to really come off of what Jacqueline said when it comes to inspiration, I completely agree. It's one of those things where, especially if you work in a creative field where the pressure is so high to create on a daily basis, there's just an output of no matter if you're in a good mood, bad mood, this is how many minutes of music you have to write today. You really get into the habit of demystifying inspiration and kind of making a craft out of it. And I think that's the same when it comes to just about anything. And the same with writing is that kind of blank page syndrome of sitting there and looking and being scared. Write anything down. Like no matter what, if the worst thing that can happen is you write something and it's absolutely horrible, and then you know what doesn't work. And that's where for me the inspiration often comes from, that I take from fiction or other media or the real world, where in that moment I was like, okay, gotta write something, gotta start somewhere. And then kind of to riff off what Steve just said, it's that for me, I try to take anything that I recently experienced, be it art, real world, whatever, and I try to figure out what it was that made me feel a certain way, be that horror, be that
Yes.
scared, be that emotion, whatever it may be. But how come, just throwing that out there, I played Silent Hill 2 or something, like another medium, like a video game. How come that game had this effect on me? And then I try to replicate that in my games instead of replicating the actual storylines. Because like that, you kind of, it's less of taking something and adapting it. And it's more of like, okay, how come this game, this book, this movie made me feel this way? And how can I make my players feel this way? And in horror, more often than not, it's obviously how can I make them feel scared or insecure or doubting their own sanity?
Yeah. So when you're drawing on a work for inspiration, or when you're seeking inspiration for something you're working on, do you primarily seek inspiration from the genre or even the subgenre that you're working in? So let's say you're doing something that involves folk horror. Do you tend to go on a deep dive that involves lots of folk horror media, or are you drawing inspiration from unusual sources, from unexpected sources, from different genres? Yeah, how much does does the genre of the media you're consuming inform what it is you're working on?
I'm afraid I don't understand the question because
Right.
so much of horror is
Mhm.
about finding an unexpected and a very safe and expected place. So the idea of finding inspiration for horror in an unexpected place doesn't really, it feels tautological to me, because
Yeah.
if you're writing horror, you should have that sort of suspense, that lead in, that idea of, oh, everything is safe and fine. Or even if everything isn't safe and fine, the idea of this is the status quo and then it's going to be shaken up. So, no, I don't really think genre plays into it necessarily. If something I did with my Martyrs game is I very specifically pulled from my suburban upbringing, and we know that in the 2008 Horrors movie, Martyrs. Why did I say horrors? I'm sorry. But in the original Martyrs, one of our first scenes after the little girl running bloody through the streets is a brother and sister fighting, and we think everything's going to be fine for 5 minutes, and it opens like a suburban drama. So, in order to write my game about the cult that creates martyrs, I actually pulled a lot of inspiration from um, a lot of, weirdly enough, a lot of like contemporary romance novels and how we sort of see families as a unit. And I also went into a lot of queer theory about the nuclear family. And I'm also a CASA. I'm a court-appointed special advocate for foster kids. So seeing how the veneer of a suburban home can hide a bunch of different things. I could have used Blue Velvet um, by David Lynch. I didn't. That would have been the expected place to go. But for me, that didn't feel expected because that's not what I needed in order to write the game. You
Mm.
find inspiration where you find it. And you'll know when you find it. And as Vincent said, you can demystify that process of finding it. You can know what it is you need to find in order to write something specific. And you're right, it might not be what someone else expects you to get inspired by. That's not the point. The point is what causes you to be able to write the thing that you
Yeah.
need to be able to write.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but I suppose where I was coming from is when you're trying to write within a particular subgenre, so whether it's cosmic horror, folk horror, whatever, how much you'd rely on media to become familiar or at least immerse yourself in the genre tropes. I agree. The inspiration, the things that make it your own special kind of horror or unexpected horror will come out of left field. But at the same time, for something to fit within a subgenre, you're probably looking at certain constraints or at least certain aesthetics that you want to draw on at the same time. So is there an element of seeking that out in media at the same time?
To sort of split the difference there, I feel like it's sort of what you're saying is it's important to be educated
Mhm.
in the subgenres that you're working in, understand its internal logics, its rules. But I probably lean more towards what Jacqueline said, where the inspiration I get for the specific story I'm writing at that moment comes from whatever's going on in my life at the moment. It's usually the inspiration of whatever's affecting me personally at that moment, rather than me trying to go and fish it out of somebody else's story that almost never works for me. It's always the thing that feels real to me because then I can make it feel real to other people, even if it doesn't exactly fit the perfect mold of the type of story that I'm being expected to write in that particular moment. I can find a way to still get that truth into that genre of story.
I think to come off of what Steve also just said, I think it's paramount that you have somewhat of a familiarity with the subject. You don't have to, actually. I think some of the best things that can happen is if you actually don't know and you just
Yeah.
go.
Yes.
And it can have incredible little accidents. But for me personally, I do know when you say, let's bring up cosmic horror, I do know what that entails. I've read enough books, I've consumed enough media to know kind of what that means. But then by familiarizing myself with it maybe a little more, that can either help afterwards steering into some of the plot points that are always there and kind of do that classical cosmic horror game, which can be fun, and maybe that's what players expect or what you should be writing. But then it's also amazing to kind of subvert all those expectations or bring some of those ideas into something else. And what always comes to mind for me personally when it comes to cosmic horror, one of my favorite pieces of media in cosmic horror is the season 1 of True Detective, which is probably the least cosmic horror story ever told. And it nailed everything about it. While it's not really it, but everything about it screamed it. And I think that's kind of what can happen is if you do this, you know what genre you're kind of working in, but then you bring your own your like what you know how to write into it and kind of adapt it, and that's how you create something new and specific to you and unique.
And actually, to come off of that, Vincent, I think, why True Detective Season 1 works so well is because it's very much character driven. And I think this is something we also need to take into account when making, writing a scenario for a tabletop RPG, that all the, role-playing games are character driven, because even more so because characters are actually creating the story. So we can take plot points, we can take different things and kind of build but what we are doing, we are not, writing the story, we are just setting up the scene for the story to be written by the players. and this is difficult because I've seen it a lot, especially on things like Call of Cthulhu, where there are let's throw cultists and monsters and madness, and it's not always going to work because the elements are there, but there's no narrative that would actually make those elements work. So it's up to the GM and more so up to the players to actually build the narrative with the elements we are providing them with. And this is difficult because it's so easy to derail. So we can do our best to set things up for supernatural folk story deep in the woods with things inspired by, I don't know, The Witch and stuff like that. And they are going to go there and do something completely different. And I know it's an issue with, maybe for some people it's an issue, for others it's not, but it is kind of a limitation in terms of what we want to set up, because this is what we are doing. We're just setting things up for the story to be written, and I guess that's something we should probably keep in mind.
I know that to bring us back to the inspiration bit on the movies and such, I think all of us on this panel, we can all confidently say that we have our own voice. So doing things like going back to the source is not going to affect our voice. It is not going to change the way we tell stories. But I think for people who are newish to the hobby or getting into it, something like a deep dive into cosmic horror or slasher horror or, whatever theme they're going with, whatever flavor they have, I think a deep dive can inform them to kind of stick to the tropes, because once you know the rules, it's cool to break them all. But until you know them all, you might be breaking something that's important to your storytelling and not realize it till you're halfway through it.
Yeah, and I think there's another aspect to that as well, which probably applies more to people who are writing RPGs than people who are perhaps, coming up with something for their home group, which is familiarity with a subgenre will help you avoid telling the same story that 50 other people have told before you. You might want to play with expectations. You might want to take genre tropes and subvert them, or do unexpected things with them. But if you're not familiar with the genre, that brilliant idea that you've got might turn out to be the most obvious trite thing to someone who's actually immersed in the genre.
Right.
So so when you're developing a project, how do you actually, if you are actively seeking out inspiration from media, how do you go about doing it? Do you look for things that are similar to what you're working on, or things within the genre? Do you go back and revisit old favorites? Do you do deep dives? Do you, solicit recommendations from other people, or do you have your own techniques for really getting into a genre or subgenre?
I know.
I mean, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. I was going to say, I know when I'm getting into something, if I'm already informed in the genre, then I'll go revisit those pieces of art that I know are going to inspire me, that I know are going to drive my own creation forward. But if it's something where I just have a passing familiarity or I'm not very familiar with it at all, I look for what's making noise in the genre, or what has made noise in the past in the genre, because that's going to do one of two things. It's going to show me the rules, and it's going to show me how to break them at the same time. Because nobody makes a genre, it's either going to be genre defining or genre defying, one or the other. And that's the kind of art I like to immerse myself in if I'm not already familiar with a topic.
Sorry, was it Stephen? Were you also speaking there?
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add because that's basically how I experience it too. About half of everything I read is the most popular or trending thing in the subject because the cultural currency that comes out of that is incredibly valuable in shaping what I will learn is the audience's expectation about my work if it's going to be perceived as being in the same space. And then the other half of what I read is just whatever I'm interested in at the moment, regardless of whatever genre I'm supposed to be deep diving in, anyways.
I also think in German we have this beautiful word, which I don't know if it exists anywhere else, but it's called a subject idiot, which is a person that knows one thing really, really well, but kind of falls flat outside. And I always have tried to, no matter what it is, to not have that happen. So personally, I always kind of, what Steve said too, like to do obviously the research and the reading the things and the consuming the things that are somewhat expected of a genre, but then also go really far out. Read Jane Austen, watch Love Actually. Okay, that's maybe a little bit of a far-fetched one, but like don't just become a tiny little ball of like knowing one thing, but really try to consume, because as Jack said, you never know where inspiration might come from. You have no idea. You could be watching a movie that has nothing to do with what you're trying to write. You could be reading a book or a comic that is completely out of left field, and that's where you will find some of the best inspiration that you can come across.
Does anyone else have anything to add to this? Then, I mean, so building on that, then, when you're actively seeking inspiration for a project, how do you go about, as both Vincent and Jacqueline have touched on, going outside your specific genre? So you're writing, a horror RPG scenario, but you want to get inspiration to try to make it feel more real, or for the setting, or just ideas to throw into it. How do you choose things from outside that genre, or seek things from outside that genre to inform what it is you're doing?
I think you almost need to be careful when you're doing that. Um, you can really spoil the mix if you're introducing elements from outside the genre. Um, like if we'll go back to Cosmic Horror. You have a Cosmic Horror scenario you're trying to craft. Um, and you start to pull in, and we'll say it's Call of Cthulhu, so it's the 20s. And you start to pull in like family dramas from that. You can do that, but you have to tie that back into horror. You can tie anything into it, but it has to make that full circle all the way back around. So I guess the question becomes, how far outside the genre are we reaching? Are we going for the absurd and then turning it on its ear? What are we doing with it?
Sorry, I have to interrupt. Family dramas are not horror? Whoa,
Good.
I'm sorry.
Well,
we're
unless
looking for something-
Cthulhu is involved in it, it's not a cosmic horror.
That is not true.
The
Okay.
Dunwich Horror?
What? When we conceive of family as a universe unto itself, as the nuclear family created really the idea of the nuclear family created in the 40s and 50s post World War II, which is usually the lens we're writing from when we write a family drama. If you're writing a family drama with a child or a teenager as your player character, that family is going to be your entire universe. You can, in fact, write a True Detective-esque version of a family drama that has all of the elements and tells of a cosmic horror. In fact, I would argue that Martyrs is a cosmic horror that is a family drama. I'm going to keep referencing that one because Martyrs is my single favorite horror movie in existence. But, and sure, even in the universe of the Cthulhu mythos, we have family dramas. Most of them, you're correct, do involve some sort of Cthulhu monster. We have everything with Nyarlathotep, whose whole thing is causing these little baby cosmic horrors to exist within family shame, within these ideas of like miscegenation and people outside of that line going, how could you fuck something from outside, which in itself becomes
Then
cosmic horrors.
at what point does this leave the genre if we're casting it directly in the horror lens?
I don't think it does.
Yeah.
I personally don't think it does. You can disagree with me on that, and that's totally fine. We're two different people. We write two different things. I don't think family drama necessarily ever does leave the horror genre.
Yeah, I think the single best example I can think of that is Michael McDowell's Blackwater, which is this epic novel that's set in, I think it's Alabama, over the course of about 70 years. And it is a generational family drama about this very wealthy logging family who are the center of their community, and what happens when this water spirit marries into their family and basically screws everything up for generations. And what makes it horror isn't in the end the supernatural element that comes in, though that water spirit is a fairly horrific character, but just the pettiness of the family drama that goes on between the characters. And that in the book is absolutely awful. They are terrible people, and they are terrible to each other. And even though it is, a sort of gothic family drama, at the end you're going to be horrified.
I would also argue that something like The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, which is a magical realism novel set over 3 generations in Chile and addresses specifically the horrors of the landowning class in Chile, and then the horrors of the, oh God, what the hell is his name? Pinochet. Why can't I fucking, sorry. I should know this. But specifically the horrors of the Pinochet junta, and those are sort of translated through this idea of spirits and apparitions and hallucinations and visitations and a lot of things you do see in cosmic horror, but the universe is smaller, right? Because the universe, those cosmos become that family, the cosmos becomes that country, the cosmos becomes that political situation. And something that I find as someone who writes a lot of horror based on my own trauma and views of trauma is that your perspective then becomes the cosmos within which you're writing, right? Like, there's a very famous Tumblr post about how if we saw a bunch of ants that were walking in a circle and chanting our name, we'd be like, what the fuck is going on down there? And that's kind of what Cthulhu does for us. And that's not necessarily horrific to us because we're the Cthulhu in that situation. If an ant was walking around chanting our name and then all of a sudden there's a giant brown eye going, what the fuck do you want? That would be fucking terrifying. You could get a whole novel out of that. And at that point, what becomes the cosmic horror is the perspective and how it's affecting you. And I think actually looking in different places for the means of that perspective is really important. I read I'm going to talk about another Operation Condor book I read recently, which was A Single Numberless Death by Nora Strailovich, which was about her and her family's experiences in the Argentinian clandestine detention centers. And these are places that were scattered through like the Naval Academy, factories in which they worked. In one very memorable place, an abandoned villa in the middle of a neighborhood. And the difference between a cult sacrificing someone to a god and the Argentine secret police torturing someone in a clandestine detention center in a place that used to be a home is practically, like, in practical terms, very minimal.
Mm.
And sort of being able to shift our perspective and go, okay, well, the cosmic horror is our fear of the unknown. It's our fear of being helpless. It's our fear of being meaningless. And then finding other ways in which people feel helpless and meaningless and nihilist, and being able to bring that into the genre, I think actually makes the genre a lot richer.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, what about everyone else? I mean, how are you drawing elements from outside the genre, inspiration from media outside the genre into your own horror?
Again, for me, kind of what I've already mentioned, but it always circles back to what I think affected me in whatever it was. Like, it's kind of the essence. So if I might be grabbing something from a drama, the reason or the thing that I'll try to distill it back down to is kind of what Pavel also touched upon, especially with those character-driven dramas, is how come I so deeply cared about this character? How come I identified with this character in this book, in this movie, what have you? What did the writer, director, whoever made that piece of media do to get me as involved as I was? Because be it in any movie, I remember I watched when I was young, I watched a Serbian film, I think it was called,
Oh,
because
God,
everybody
yes.
everybody was talking about how incredibly gruesome that was. And
Mm,
I did not, quote unquote, it did not have an effect. It did have an effect on me because I just thought, what the hell is this? But it didn't disturb me the way Requiem for a Dream did, or the way Martyrs did.
yeah, yeah.
Because those are like, Martyrs is one of the pieces of media that has disturbed me the most, because you actually care about characters. It didn't, like, for me, Requiem for a Dream, to this day, one of the most horrifying movies, because you so deeply care and can identify with these characters. And then so I watched this movie to take it as an example, not strictly horror, obviously, but how come I so deeply cared about Ellen Bernstein's character? What made me as the viewer be so invested? And then I tried to take that kind of whatever Darren Aronofsky did to make this. I tried to incorporate that into the game. And again, kind of really what Pavel said, it is so important when it comes to TTRPG. Character is more important than almost anything, because it is the entire lifeblood and through line. And the hard thing is, we don't control the character. Like, that's what makes it even harder.
Yeah.
Because if you write a novel, if you direct a movie, you control the line of the character, of your protagonist. And as if you write a TTRPG or you run a TTRPG, you have to kind of give over the reins to somebody and just go like, well, I'm going to follow you, and not just you, but probably an entire table through this adventure, and try to infuse these things that I've taken from other places.
Pavel, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Oh, honestly, I don't know, because to be honest, I rarely go to like actively seek for inspiration. I'm more of a guy who's like, okay, I have a bunch of ideas that just try to, kind of figure them out on myself, or like on my own. And actually, it's pretty funny because I have this list and my game Whispers of the Woods. It's basically the last page is inspirations, and there are different titles listed, but it's very, like, it tells a lot that it's the last page, because it wasn't like all those things didn't inspire me. I was like pursuing all those elements or narratives to actually put in the game. It's more like I've written the game and was like, okay, so what I feel, what I think kind of inspired me, maybe more kind of subconsciously, rather than, just like that. So I just listed things that kind of, I thought, oh, maybe this is something that I kind of took from, but I didn't do that on purpose. So to be honest, I'm not sure if I have a lot to add here in terms of seeking inspiration, especially outside of the genre, because this is something I feel like it happens naturally, but I do feel like it's super important to, even if not for inspiration, just for development, just go outside of the genres we write in, and sometimes even outside of our comfort zone, because it can only help to develop games stories, to be a better GM as well. I guess because if it's good, it's good, and doesn't matter what kind of genre it is. There's always something we can learn from. So I try to sometimes do that, but again, probably not to go actively looking for inspirations, kind of to be brought back to horror genre. But just kind of, it probably does affect me either way.
No, I think that's a good point. I think most of us probably draw the majority of our inspiration passively or at least automatically from the kinds of things we just consume regularly. Obviously, yes, there are going to be the situations where we've discussed where you're working on a particular project and you've perhaps gone out to seek stuff. But I think no, you're right. I think that's probably going to be most people's experiences. I when we're talking about inspiration, and we've been talking about inspiration in very broad terms here, but when we're talking about inspiration for our games, what kinds of elements are you looking to draw, or have you drawn from media when you've been working on stuff? Is it just like, Vincent, you were talking about characters and so on. So is it like, characters and character motivations? Is it plot elements? Is it, even things like, the general tone, the aesthetic, the structure of the media? What kinds of things do you find yourself, consciously pulling in, or maybe even retroactively you have drawn on from something?
Yeah. I often try to not grab too much from one place because I think it can make it quite obvious what inspiration is. I think mostly what I found myself trying to draw from other places is tone, actually. I think tone is one of the hardest things to achieve, especially at a table, too, which goes into a completely different discussion about atmosphere and all of that, which can be very hard to achieve because it's not just whoever's running the game. But getting the tone right, especially in horror, I think is so hard to do and is key to get the game just right. So personally, that's where I think I mostly try to grab. That's what I mostly try to grab from other media. I think we've talked about True Detective. I think tone is so good in that first season. I've mentioned Silent Hill, which I think stands as a masterpiece for a reason, and I actually think part of that is tone. So I often try to incorporate that and then build my ideas around it without completely taking it for granted. If that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else?
So I think I've touched upon this a little bit when I was talking about getting inspired by others people's games. So I didn't only mean, tabletop role-playing games, but also video games. So when I'm, playing or just even watching an actual play or something like that, and I'm always trying to kind of analyze why this is scary in this specific context, because obviously, watching a movie, etc., it's a bit easier, there are so many different techniques and so many different kind of plot points to make us scared. And okay, obviously I understand that it's not only about getting scared in horror, it's more than that, but in this specific context, when, playing different tabletop games or video games, I'm just thinking, how, like, what's in this game? What's so special in the mechanics and in this kind of link between mechanics and the narrative that kind of works for me, that kind of makes me uneasy, makes me scared. And I try to kind of dissect that and then see, how I can kind of bring some of those elements and make them work for my game. And it's very interesting because as I mentioned, for me, like mechanics, there are so many different things in mechanics that can work beyond the narrative. I mean, the perfect example would be Dread. So
Oh
it's
yeah.
the role-playing game where you don't use dice, you use Jenga. For those of you who don't know, and basically you just pull the Jenga blocks, and it's all fun and games until you basically so close to collapse, right? And then the stakes get so much higher because one small mistake outside of the game, right? Outside of the narrative, which is basically one mistake on your part in the meta game can cost you dearly, and that builds so much tension. And it's so simple. It's just ridiculous how simple it is, but it works so goddamn well, and I absolutely love
Mm.
it. So things like that, I think I actually try to always look at those things that kind of works in a similar way and dissect, kind of try to analyze why does it work and how I can learn from sorry, learn from that.
Mm. Uh, anyone else?
Well, just to jump off of Dread, that was
Mm.
one that I wanted to try and figure out how I could replicate in a virtual environment.
Yeah.
And that's a tough one, right? So I came up with Minesweeper, which basically does many of the same things, where the board gets increasingly more dangerous as you go, and at any moment you could wreck the board and switch that flip for everyone. So I found that to be, a tool just in my back pocket. If I ever want to tell a dread-based story in a virtual environment, you can pull up a communal Minesweeper for everyone. But back on the actual topic of, I would like to defend subgenre and like the mixing, pulling in elements from subgenres.
Mm.
Why you should be a little careful in doing that, and that's because the subgenre is so powerful for communicating internal logic and tone, like Vincent was talking about, to the other people collaborating with you on the story. So it has value in and of what it is as a communication tool, as a collaboration tool, knowing the rules of the genre that you're and the subgenre that you're writing in together. So when you are going to pull in external influences, be very deliberate about why you're doing it. Why are you breaking these rules? And what is the goal of breaking these rules? Like, what is it you're trying to accomplish by doing that? And there's usually a good reason, but there's also an equally good reason for why those genre rules exist in the first place and what they're doing for telling that specific type of story.
Mm. I suppose the counter argument, it's not really a counter argument, but another way of looking at it might be that, if you do end up completely breaking the subgenre by bringing all these other elements in, that's how new subgenres are created. So, maybe you've just made something new. That might not have been your intent. That might have failed what you were actually setting out to do if you're writing to a spec. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a useless exercise.
Right, absolutely. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying do
Yeah.
it intentionally. Like
Yeah,
do it
absolutely.
with
Yeah.
thought and not just casually. Like you should understand the rules to break them.
Does anyone else have anything to throw into this? Right, we had a question from the audience. What is the point that you recommend media as a prerequisite? And hang on, Sorry, I'm just making sure I understand the question. What is the point that you recommend media as a prerequisite, and when you share primarily as so? Right. So, I mean, how how much is media? If I'm understanding this properly, how much is media, or at least inspiration from media, a prerequisite to something you're working on, and how much is it a reference? On
I
Jax's
think what
point,
the question is, I think what
oh
the
yeah,
question is asking is, when do you say, hey, you need to have watched this piece of media in order to understand this horror, rather than,
right,
hey, this piece of horror references this piece of media, but you
yeah.
don't necessarily have to know about it,
Yeah,
which
I
I
think that makes
suspect.
perfect sense. Yes.
Mhm. And for my answer, I don't really write anything that I think a horror, I try not to write anything where something is a prerequisite to
Hmm.
playing it, right? Because I want to be able to share the story I'm trying to tell, not share someone else's story in a different format.
Yeah.
Um, I do like including mediographies because I think saying, hey, here are the things I was inspired by, and you can get a different or a richer understanding of what I am telling you by being familiar with these texts. But I'm also really interested in what players bring to the game.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at writing novels. I can't write novels. I can write short stories. And the reason this is because I'm so invested in the things other people bring
Hmm.
to the table. I love setting up dominoes for other people to knock down. So if a mediography allows me to put in another domino for someone else to knock down, then I'm going to do that. And if it doesn't, then I won't.
Yeah, yeah. I had a conversation some time back with a friend of mine who's a fiction writer, and he was saying that from his point of view, RPG scenarios are like the almost the opposite of a story. He described them as the negative space of a story. You're creating the elements in which a story can happen, as opposed to writing the story. And I've always found that a really interesting way of looking at it. So yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. Uh, Anyone else? Well, we had another question, which was, what would you say the biggest trends are in horror right now? And I mean, if we're bringing that back to the main discussion, it's, and how are those informing either what you're writing or what you're seeing in tabletop RPG writing? I I'm guessing no one has got anything to say about that. Yeah, I personally, I
I mean, I'm sure we could tell you about the biggest trends in our personal writing right now because everybody has their own personal trends, but I'm not sure any of us could give you a market analysis, unfortunately.
yeah. Well, no, I mean, then I think that's a perfectly good way of looking at it because you're certainly going to be informed by the stuff that you're consuming. So I mean, Jacqueline, what do you see as the biggest trends in what you're working on?
I've been working on a lot of stuff about support classes, essentially. Um, when I write, I am currently submitting things to the Delta Green Shotgun Scenario Contest. If you're not familiar with it, folks on
Hmm.
the panel or audience, you should definitely join it. It's still open until December 15th, and it is a free to submit contest where you write a Delta Green Shotgun scenario, 1,500 words or less. It's super fun. It's a great writing exercise. I really enjoy it. Um, but something I've been enjoying writing for that is stuff that's kind of off the beaten path, like writing about crowd crush scenarios where you're EMTs who are aligned with Delta Green instead of, FBI agents. Because you have to have medics who are part of Delta Green, and you have to have therapists who are part of Delta Green, because you have to take care of the people who are damaged by the horrors without it getting out. I like writing. I guess you could say it's conspiracy horror, but it's specifically around the people who support the people on the front lines. And I find that is it's so character focused, and it's very much about your relationships and about why you care enough to keep doing this thing. And I've really found a nice little sort of home in that area. I mean, in a fucked up way, the Martyrs game that I'm putting out in February, which is not about being a martyr, it's about being the cult that creates the martyrs, is kind of a way of writing about support classes too, because it's about the system that puts the women through those tortures in order to create martyrs.
Mm.
And I'm very interested in like supply lines, logistics, what it looks like to be the person who is driving the food and the medicine and the ammunition
Yeah.
to people so that they can actually do things.
Yeah. How about anyone else? Are there any particular trends in horror that you're seeing in your own work or that are influencing you?
I think for me, which is also again coming from like a media background in the sense of film composition, I think a big trend that is also seen and has been seen for quite a while now is this idea. I'm going to call it an idea, even though it's very true too, but of elevated horror.
Mm.
Because I think it's not really crazy to say that horror isn't as niche anymore as it used to be. It's
Yes,
gotten a
absolutely.
lot broader audience since, and not since this is not because of A24. I would never say anything like that, but it has had a big effect on a lot of people. A lot of people who haven't really been in this horror genre for as long as probably most people here have been, found a way into that genre through movies like Hereditary, through movies like Midsummer and or The Witch. And I think I see it personally in a lot of my, not my own writing, but other people's work that I get to work on, is that there is often a trend to kind of, I don't want to say replicate that, but kind of fit into that elevated horror niche,
Yeah.
where it's like, it's not slasher, it is not just cosmic horror, it's like everything has to have this deeper, more sincere meaning behind it, which is can be amazing if it works, and I think it can be detrimental when it doesn't. Actually, I think it can ruin a really good idea by trying to inject some grander meaning that seems shoehorned into it. Because again, I think horror mostly lives in whatever scares a society, and that's why I love the genre so much. I think it's one of the greatest genres to look back throughout history, and you can exactly see what different societies, what the pressure points were, what they were scared of, like sociologically speaking, be it like home invasion horror, be it cosmic horror and the sphere of the otherness. I think horror is such a great genre for that throughout all kinds of media. And I think if it kind of holds true to that nowadays, it works better than people trying to fit into a niche to write in that they don't really understand, or that is not really sincere. I think it's not that they don't understand it. I think horror works best if it is sincere. I think most writing is. But yeah, I think that's kind of a trend that I tend to spot, is this kind of elevated horror that
Yeah.
people try to fall into.
Yeah, yeah. I interviewed my friend Jared Logan recently, and was speaking to him about this, and he said that he was heartily sick of horror that existed solely as a metaphor. I'm not entirely sure I agree with him on that, because I think it can work, and I've seen some good films that do work that way, but I definitely get where he's coming from. Um, but also, yeah, what you're talking about there with the way horror's shifting and and appealing to a larger audience. You see that in publishing as well. It's something I've noticed over the last 10 years, which is the number of horror novels that are out there just with covers where you'd look at them and you wouldn't realize they were horror novels just because of the way they're marketed. The covers are all in pastel colors and they're very abstract looking, or draw a lot from nature. And you compare that to the really lurid horror paperbacks of the 1980s, and it's like polar opposites. Which I think is a significant shift in the genre.
Yeah, and I think what may be an issue with all kind of elevator or post-horror things, if people are trying to actually convert this to role-playing games, is again, it's very much character driven. There is
Yeah.
drama that, as Jacqueline mentioned, is something that we can look at and bring to the table and kind of mix it up, and the horror kind of can come from that as well, and we just add some supernatural elements as a metaphor, for example. But the problem is that, again, we've mentioned this already a few times, it's very much, players driven narrative, right? So if they don't follow the metaphor, if it doesn't have that meaning for them, then it'll fall flat, and it's just that, I guess. So it's much easier to just throw like, a supernatural killer and make it a slasher and everyone's die because we play Dread, for example, and it's a lot of fun, and we can basically keep that structure of a subgenre like slasher mostly intact, and it converts pretty well-ish, I guess. But there are definitely some subgenres that probably more difficult to actually adapt into other things. It's not only adapting to tabletop RPGs. It's like I'm always saying, horror is the most difficult genre in comic books, and it doesn't work 99% of the time. And there are very few. I've actually written a piece on that, and I've talked about it a lot. It's not a subject of this, but just kind of as an example that sometimes horror can't really translate that well as we want it to translate. And sometimes, in different media, there are different narrative tools that helps to make horror what it is. And sometimes in tabletop RPGs, for example, it doesn't always work. And that's why, like, the question, because I'm trying to answer the question, believe me, about kind of different trends. So I'll be writing a supplement for Corp work very soon. And one of the things that there's just a lot of feedback from people that, okay, this game is super scary, not because all of the kind of supernatural elements, but because it hits close to home. And it's so cathartic to play it. So this is like, a signal for me. Okay, so I should tap into that more. So I shouldn't follow the trends and corporate horror and kind of look for literature and different pieces of media around that subject. I should probably go back and look, kind of reflect on real life stuff that actually made the base game scary for so many people. So that's kind of, again, escaping from that media influence a little bit into more kind of real world stuff. But then again, I guess I will probably go back to different kind of corporate horror things in fiction because I need to add that flavor as well, right? So there are so many things that I could get inspired by. So I'll probably probe around those a little bit more. Although it's a pretty niche genre, so it's not like a lot of movies or a lot of things. I remember again to what Jacqueline said about different kind of going to different genres. One of the inspirations for Corp work was actually oh gosh, no, obviously I have such a hole in my mind. The HBO series about all those millionaires. What it's called?
Oh, White
Please help me.
Lotus?
No. Oh
Succession?
gosh.
Succession.
Succession. Oh, of
yes,
course.
okay.
Thank you so much. So that was a huge inspiration as well, right? So it's not a horror. It's not supernatural, but it is a piece of media that greatly inspired Coburg in some aspects. So I'll probably still try to stay on top of things like that, and consciously or unconsciously incorporate some elements.
Yeah. Topher, I mean, are there any particular kind of trends that you've picked up on, or that you're in either your own work or the larger media landscape that you've been incorporating?
Um, a lot of what I have been doing, because my current projects right now aren't dealing with horror. I just don't find myself dealing with a lot of horror projects at the moment. But for inspiration, I'm doing a lot of history in what I'm doing. I'm delving into a lot of historical texts, figuring out how some of the political works have moved in the later Middle Ages to replicate some aspects of feudal kingdoms and feudal society. So, but that's what I've been working.
For stuff like that, I'm always interested in how useful it is drawing on fiction for stuff that is rooted in the real world, because I guess most people's experiences of historical settings or real world settings are probably derived from fictional media as opposed from actual history anyway. So, I mean, do you find it useful, say, reading historical fiction in the kind of setting you're working with, and digging out material from there, or are you researching entirely from historical sources?
I try to stick to primary or secondary sources when I do my researches on these things, mostly because the true history, and I know this is a diversion from our topic, but the true history is just so much more fascinating a lot of times than what people are making up. Um, and I need that verisimilitude in what I'm creating, so that's just where I've been working.
Now, we something we've touched on a number of times is just, no, sorry, I'll rephrase that. It, 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 it seems that because most of us write this stuff for other people to play or write it for publication, that our experiences of seeking inspiration aren't necessarily the same as people looking for stuff for their home games. If someone is seeking to, perhaps take inspiration from their favorite horror film and use that as the basis for a scenario, for something they're presenting to their home group. How it's something I'm sure we've all done at some stage. How do you do that? How do you take that borrowed idea, that key borrowed idea, and make it your own, make it into something new? I wondered, Jacqueline, particularly, whether you might have anything here, because you've talked about how much this game you're working on borrows from Martyrs, or at least is inspired by Martyrs. I mean, how much do you look at Martyrs for that inspiration, and how do you turn it into something that's, well, not just Martyrs?
So the game that I'm working on is primarily about being one of the spouses in the family that is one of several families creating martyrs. They're called witnesses in the game because we had to, shave off the serial numbers. But so from Martyrs, what I took is the idea that you have to take a young marginalized woman and torture her until she either breaks or becomes a martyr. And I also took the idea that there are these nice suburban families that are doing that. And from there, I took sort of the idea of the clandestine detention centers from Argentina, because that was a major part of my research, because this idea of hiding in plain sight, you can, like, that is a thing people do, and it can be done a lot easier than you think. So I'm not reusing the same number of people in the family. I'm not even reusing the setting in the south of France. It is a normal family, as defined as white, middle class, heteronormative couple I've had some people play it as like a Mormon splinter group. I've had some people play it as a Cthulhu group. But the idea is that you're where I guess where Martyr stops and where the game begins is the focus is on this family that the player creates. And so the story is going to be primarily about their family, and the girl they're trying to turn into a martyr is only one part of that story, which expands outwards in different directions from martyrs. So you are telling a similar story. You may even be telling a parallel story, but you're not telling the story of martyrs.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, for everyone else, I mean, there are any projects like that, right? Any things that you've done just for fun, maybe, where you've borrowed heavily from an existing media source, but found ways to make it your own.
I think I did a little bit. Well, it depends how you define a little. But for Whispers of the Woods, there are basically free scenarios in the game that players can use. And each is inspired or kind of based on an actual story from culture, pop culture. One is about the Witch in the Woods, which, was told thousands of times in different versions. One is about Elkönig, which is basically kind of Elf's King. It's from Goethe's poem. It's basically a figure from folk, kind of Germanic folklore. And the one is about Basilisk, and more so kind of Polish Basilisk, because there are also different versions of Basilisk and culture. So each kind of borrows heavily from those tropes, and kind of the central figure is pretty well defined and kind of known from culture. And then I was always trying to kind of put my spin on it in a way. And obviously, I don't have so much control. I have just enough control to kind of lay the ground and kind of put those elements for the players to actually interact with, because the game is heavily players based. Like the GM is inconsequential. Like it can be played GMless. What I've tried to do is I was trying to kind of figure out how people could actually go in there and what they could do to kind of put some elements to subvert their expectations. So I was actually trying to figure out, what kind of, from role-playing perspective, how those players, because the players play as normal villagers in this game. So they are not heroes, they're just regular plain villagers and kind of 18th kind of century setting. So farmers and the like. So I wanted to kind of introduce all those adventures as something that would be somewhat familiar. So a familiar figure like Basilisk, and kind of always starts in a way that, okay, there's this monster that's terrifying and scary and probably hurting other people. And then they go into the woods with some kind of expectations what's going to be there, and I always try to subvert it. Like I always try to write those adventures in a way that would have a twist, like that would kind of challenge their expectations and their way of thinking about what's wrong, what's right. So to leave kind of more of a to kind of give them freedom to actually see the consequences of their actions that are not always just, good or bad. It's not long, it's not going to end with killing the monster, because maybe monster is not a monster. Maybe you are the monsters because you actually fall into a trap of being, so kind of, I don't know, sometimes racist, sometimes otherwise, but just kind of I was trying to play on that a little bit. So it's not always easy, because then again, it's up to the players how they want to kind of treat that narrative. But it was a lot of fun to kind of play with those stories that have been told numerous times, different incarnations, but kind of going from that subverting of initial expectations, and hopefully that worked. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that sounds terrific. Um, Stephen, is this something that you've done at all, kind of drawing on existing work and finding ways of making it your own?
Yeah, so my game Fifth Conspiracy, the conceit of the game is that everything people believe in is real because people believe in it. And
Oh
the more
yeah,
people
yeah.
believe in it, the more real the ideas become. And then you play those ideas that have come to life.
Oh,
And
nice.
you're competing for the this limited resource, which is people's attention. But the attention you need is different depending on the idea that you are. If you're the boogeyman, you need to scare people. But if you're a god, you need to be worshipped. So I drew from a lot of traditional horror tropes when designing kind of a quarter of all of the things that you can be in the game based off of, for example, the undead, right? So that's everything from vampires and zombies and ghosts, and they all need something from the living. They all need to take. They need to steal life, right? And that's a theme you see over and over in that kind of horror. But then there's your monsters, and your monsters live near society, but they are not part of society. They are taboo. There's something about them that is unacceptable to the mores of the society that they're next to, whether it's cannibalism or mixing in an unclean way, and that also is also borrowed heavily from existing tropes in horror. What makes something monstrous? Why do we consider something monstrous? And I borrowed heavily from, all kinds of different sources of fiction in order to try and come up with, well, what are the core tropes of if somebody wanted to make a monster, what would that look like mechanically in a tabletop role-playing game?
Yeah, no, I like that. Vincent, is this something you've got any experience of?
Yes, because I mainly I mainly write for my table or like the tables IGM for. And I have to say, one of the earliest things I've done, which was not for horror, I have to be that honest, it was for D&D because like so many people, that's how I started getting into the hobby. Um, One of my biggest inspirations was, so I was born and raised in Switzerland, and I moved to the US when I was 20. So it's been a while, but I still go home. My whole family is back home. And for me, one of those things that really started fascinating me, as it tends to happen when somebody doesn't really live at home anymore, is you try to find a way to connect with your home in a new way. So for me, one of the many things was to actually kind of start learning about mythology and about stories told in Swiss culture, which you kind of get told, anybody that knows anything about Germanic culture, and like I'm sure Pavel knows, our kids' stories are not child friendly, really. It's everything is it'll come for you and it'll cut off your toes, fingers, and eat them. And I was told these stories as a kid by my grandma because that's what you do. That's how you have children stop, biting their nails because Struwwelpeter comes with the scissors. So I started looking into all of these really ancient Swiss myths and drew so much inspiration from it. And then one of the things I learned through that is how much, especially because, they're really old, the environment and the landscape play into what cultures told each other at that time plays into it. So for me, it's so clear nowadays that when I go back home and I walk through these crazy forests and the Alps, it's like you completely understand how stories came to be that like people told each other thousands, 2000s, or even more, even longer ago. You go to Scotland and you walk through the moors and you're like, completely understand how they believe all of these things. It's like, of course there's a will-o-wisp. Why wouldn't there be a will-o-wisp? So that's where I drew so much inspiration from my early games of D&D especially, and then also into horror when I started DMing horror games. And the great thing about it is if you are playing with people who are not from exactly the same culture as you, or even maybe they just don't know, you have a ace up your sleeve, because I DM'd for people that are mainly from the US, and nobody's ever heard of Chaketa or other festivals that we have in Switzerland and Myth, and for them it was brand new. And those are ancient stories. There's not a copyright, it's for a home table, nothing. And it's a it was a huge help for me. And I implore anybody that's getting into trying to write for their own home table, their own home brew, start in your own backyard, kind of speak. Look there, because it's also horror you will most likely understand, even if you didn't experience. I wasn't alive in the Swiss Alps 2,000 years ago, but I can take a walk outside and go, yep, I get that. I know why that rock was called the Devil's Rock, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I get that. My father was Scottish, and I've drawn an awful lot on Scottish folklore in the stuff that I've written in, because it's absolutely fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, but when you've done that, when you've drawn upon these folkloric elements, I mean, like Pavel was talking about, are there any particular ways you've tried to put your own twist on them, or when you've done that, have you pretty much presented them as you learned the folk tales?
No, I personally tried to change them, because also I had to make them work in a different, like D&D was just very different. Again, it was a different mechanic, it was a different framework that I adapted them into. But then even I have incorporated some of them into Cult, which is mainly the game I play and love. Or also Call of Cthulhu, I've incorporated ideas into that as well from it, because it's really handy. I try to, again, kind of rehashing my point from figuring out what made it so scary. What was the thing that scared these people, and then trying to put my players into a similar situation and then let them run. Again, that is kind of the playground. I love the analogy of putting up dominoes to knock over. That is, I'm going to steal that analogy. That's incredible. And kind of set up these dominoes, and then once they kind of start falling, adapt the monster. In those cases it was always an evil entity or some kind of horror, kind of adapt that horror to how those dominoes fell, because it was always quite malleable. And so if it tended to go more into the personal horror, the monster would, or the horror would kind of lean more towards that side than into the folk horror, maybe. Because traditionally all of these stories ended up being folk horror, but I never really ran a folk horror game. So I always took them out of that framework and then plopped them into another
Setting.
framework, in another setting. Another thing in Switzerland that is just huge, and a lot of European countries, is masks. Wood masks. And again, as a child, scary as hell. Like, again, Santa for us in Switzerland, not a cool guy, not cool, not fun. You're scared so badly. Like, I would hide when Santa came to our house, and he came every year, and he comes with a book where he reads the good things you did and the bad things you did, and if you did too many bad things, you get whipped. So those kind of fears I try to incorporate, those fears of masks that I had on Carnival when the witches came. It's the mask that scares you. And so in my very first ever campaign in D&D, I ran masks were a huge theme throughout it. So that's kind of what I grabbed. And I was like, yep, masks scared me personally. And my D&D games were always kind of horror anyway. It's like, they scare me personally, so let me try to scare you with masks, or let me impart that little fear I have. And I get to work through it. That's the nice thing about running horror. You in turn get to actually work through your little childhood trauma of the witch outside the window.
Yeah. How about you, Topher? Is there any examples of stuff you've lifted and transformed in interesting ways?
Okay, so I'm also going to have to rely on D&D here because I'm sure I've done it for horror, but I can't come up with any concrete things I can point to and said I pulled this from this to do this on this. I published a series of introductory adventures for new DMs on DM's Guild called Realms, and they're nothing more than little funny things where I take a movie and I take all the plot signposts from that movie and I rewrite them as a D&D plot. And it's obvious. I mean, it's I'm not trying to hide anything when I do this. I'm like, this is taken from this movie. Uh, but it's just a simple two-page plot. Taking like I've done Sharknado, I've done Romancing the Stone, I've done Leprechaun.
But do you find that the process of not just converting that into a scenario, converting those plot points into a scenario, but the process of actually running those as a game and incorporating other people at the table and their decisions and so on, do you find that by the time that plays out, that it's actually anything like the source material, even if even if that was the main inspiration,
No,
or is it?
absolutely not.
Yeah, right.
No, it never. I'll take Sharknado. You're never running Sharknado. You're running
Yeah.
a series of events that resemble Sharknado, and what your characters do in that is the story.
Hmm.
The plot events that are happening in the background is just the color that they're acting against.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think, for people who are looking for eh, ideas for their home games, looking for ways to take inspiration from media, that's probably the big thing to remember, that you can just lift something pretty much wholesale. You can take the premise of your favorite film or your favorite horror story and throw it at the table, and by the time your players interact with it, it is going to become something unrecognizable. You're not just going to end up rehashing whatever it is
Exactly.
that inspired you in the first place.
Well, you can't because you have 3 to 6 extra individuals at the table, and they're all bringing their own perspective and their own enjoyment of what is going on to what you're doing. And if it's any table I've ever ran, whatever I have written down on my notes to do for that event is gone out the window within 20 minutes of starting that game.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. We're down to the last 10 minutes, so let's just have a. I think what should be a fairly quick question from the audience here, which is, there has been a lot of talk about inspiration from books, movies, and games, but how about music? Is there a song or an album that has inspired you?
I think that's that's my favorite question. Thank you, whoever asked that. As a like musician by trade, yes, absolutely. The way I do it, which I'm sure it's not unique at all, there is there's music. I studied classical music, so there's a lot of music that really will. There's horror music in classical. There's horror music in anything.
Mm.
Anything can inspire you. You can listen to "Threaten Me for Victims" from Iwo Chiva by like Penderecki, which is insane. And well, it's insane. So that's things like that I do like to listen to. However, the way I work it as a film composer, again, very biased on that question. I try, especially I think it ties back into writing in a genre or in a subgenre or in a trying to evoke a feeling or a setting or um, the atmosphere of something. When I write for my table, when I start writing my campaigns, when I start writing whatever we're going to play, I put on music, I think, as a lot of people do.
Mm.
And I put on music that I think will get me in that right mindset. So I'm very biased towards composers like Bobby Krillick, who I absolutely love, is absolute incredible human, or Mark Corbin, or any of the old Jerry Goldsmith. I can listen to just about anything and I know what gets me in the right mindset. And that's always music because I obviously can't watch a movie while I write. I'm not that person. I can't do that. I know people can. That's not me. So I like to
Yeah.
sit down and I put on the headphones or turn up the speakers and I listen to whatever music inspires me to write in the genre or write in the style that I would like this adventure, this scenario to go. And that's how I use music as inspiration. So I kind of use it subconsciously. I put it on and then let it kind of slowly manipulate me in the right direction.
How about you, Pavel? Is there, do you draw any inspiration from music?
Oh gosh, I do, but not for tabletop role-playing games, to be honest, because like I probably look for something else than Vincent because he mentioned classical music, and I'm more of a kind of, I look for storytelling through lyrics, and I absolutely love like some of my favorite songs are just, I don't really care about the music, I kind of care about the story that's being told. And those stories sometimes have such a profound impact on me, but I feel they kind of they're within such a small microcosmos of of narrative that it's very difficult to unpack it and to kind of make it an adventure. I feel like sometimes it really does inspire me to write comic books because it's something I've done in the past, not so much nowadays. But yeah, that definitely works for me as an inspiration. But again, maybe for kind of more linear storytelling than for role-playing games, but for sure, 100%.
No, I think it's interesting you talk about lyrics there because I mean, my personal experience is that with song lyrics, so many of them aren't coherent narratives. That you have moments of strong imagery and moments of strong emotion. That it's just those little bits rather than an overarching story within a song that grab me and tend to spiral off into other thoughts. Um, Stephen, is this something that you relate to at all?
One of the tools I like to use for any campaign I'm going to run, so anything more than like a one shot with a group of players, is I will ask each player after they've come up with their character to give me the theme song for their character.
Yeah.
Um, and it forces them to kind of think about the emotional experience of their character because that's what songs are. They hit us in the emotions, not in the head, right? So they've given me a background, they've given me a story, the milestones that turn the character into who they are. But now they have to think about what is the lived experience of that character, and then just having done that, as we start to play, they'll post other songs. Oh, now it's this song,
Yeah.
or we had this moment between these two characters, and that is this song, and they'll keep sharing these songs. And what I'll do is I'll save them, and I will play their theme in important moments. I'll
Oh,
turn it down so that
nice.
it's low because they tend to have lyrics, and I don't want it to be too disruptive to the experience. But I'll play their theme in the background when they're having their big moments, and then I'll switch to that song that was about the relationship between these two characters when they're having that moment. And I always get smiles from ear to ear from the players when their song comes on. It's a very strong callback, and I would suggest it to anybody.
Yeah, my friend Nick Rosenberg refers to her characters having entrance music, which I really like. Um, Jacqueline, is this something you relate to at all?
Yes. When I'm playing, I tend to build character playlists. So
Mm.
something very similar to what Steve said. I love collecting music that sounds like a character that I'm playing. I also, bouncing back to Vince, there's a lot of classical music that I love for writing horror. The Rite of Spring is one of my favorite ballets for writing horror in existence. If I'm writing something like more transcendental or transformative horror, so something where the character maybe goes through a horrific process to become a god or expand beyond themselves, I'm actually going to reach more for the Firebird or the planets. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, also weirdly enough, Vivaldi, great for writing horror, was referred to. Yeah, well, he was referred to as essentially the rock star of the Baroque
Oh
period.
yeah.
So any Vivaldi music, but especially Winter from the Seasons, is one of my favorite inspiration pieces. in terms of contemporary music, there's a little British pub band that I actually saw in concert recently called Love Cat, and their music has been really, really helpful for me in writing character-driven and focused horror.
Oh, fantastic. And Topher, how about you?
Um, I have music on almost constantly, doing anything. It's just a constant in my life. So I don't have anything in particular I could point to, but this is probably the longest period today I'll go without listening to music.
I will, if I can, one more because
Sure.
on the thing of especially contemporary music, it's not that brand new anymore. But I can implore anyone, one of my first experiences, I think, with horror in general was if anybody knows it's a metal band, prog metal band from England called Porcupine Tree.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Their album, The Incident, is an entire concept album, which is a horror in its own way, what they talk about. I don't want to give anything away. Give it a listen, read through the lyrics, read through what it's about, look at the incredible art that is made by an artist called Lasse Hoyle, who I believe he's definitely from up north. I'm not quite sure anymore where, Swedish or Norwegian, but incredible art. His art has been an inspiration for so many things for me as well, especially because it involves a lot of masks. He shot a lot of the music videos for Porcupine Tree and Steven Wilson solo project. All of those things are pure gold when it comes to inspiration for me. It's gold dust, especially when it comes to horror. So that's my last little modern music plug. That it's not just classical.
Nice.
But yes,
well,
The Rite of Spring too. I couldn't agree more.
Of course. Well, then I think there's just time to wrap things up. So, well, first of all, thank you all very much for taking part in this panel. I've had a great time. Where can people find you and your work online? Let's start off with, well, Vincent.
Thank you so much for having me. Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. This was great. Such a great panel. Thank you all. It was really great. You can find me under Lorefall on YouTube and on Patreon. I mainly do how-to plays. I've done it for Cult. I've done it for Alien and Mothership. There's hopefully a lot more coming. This coming week, we're starting a solo playthrough of the brand new scenario by Helmgast, Deep Waters, which I'm really, really excited about. So please tune in. It would mean a lot. And thank you. You'll find us Lorefall, and that's it. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. And Pavel, where can people find you and your work?
Okay, so first of all, also wanted to say thank you. Thank you, Scott, for hosting this panel. Thank you for my dear panelists. Thanks for the invite, Illusion Horror and Con. And yeah, you can find me at Heltung Storytelling. You can find me on Drive for RPG, or on my store. There's some promo now, so go buy my stuff. But also you can find Corvborg online as well. There's a separate page for that. So yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, brilliant. And Stephen, where can people find you and your work?
Thank you again for having me. This is such a fun topic. You can find me at aedpublishing.com and at AED Publishing on all the socials. And my game is Fifth Conspiracy.
Well, thank you very much. And Topher, where can people find you and your work?
I am published on DM's Guild under Topher Burke, and you can find me on startplaying.games/GM/UNC.
Well, thank you very much. And Jacqueline, how about you? Where can people find you and your work?
Hi, thank you so much. I am Rufflejax on most places, RuffleJax. we're really excited. We have a couple new cult books coming out. The Holiday Scenario is coming out this month, which I'm very excited to get my little editor paws on. My game Bear Witness, which is a solo game based on Martyrs, will be coming out in February through Zine Club, +1 RPG Zine Club. I will also be putting it on my itch.io, which is rufflejacks.itch.io. You can also see me in a bunch of other games, including Changeling Lost 2nd Edition, Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition, Vampire the Requiem 2nd Edition, Exalted 3rd Edition, Fading Suns, whole bunch of stuff. But most places you can find me very active online as Rufflejax. Again, that's RUFFLEJAX.
Thank you very much. And if people want to find any of my stuff, I am the co-host of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast, where Matt Sanderson and I talk about Call of Cthulhu and horror media with various guest hosts. And you can find me on a bunch of actual plays, including Ain't Slayed Nobody, How We Roll, Grizzly Peaks Radio, and Push the Roll with Ross Bryant. And so, thank you again to the organisers of Lucian HorrorCon, and thank you again for everyone who took part in the panel and everyone who's been watching us. Right, cheerio.